Epiphany is often a hard word to say. Sometimes it's difficult to understand even when we know what it means, because Epiphany at its heart is discovery. Each year, in some ways, Epiphany means something new, and we look back on our journey through Advent, our exploration and experience of Christmas, and our visioning and dreaming of what the next year could be, and Epiphany means something new. Over the last month, we've listened to angels tell people in the Christmas story, don't be afraid. We've even gone back and listened to that same message echoing through the prophets to the people of Israel years before. Don't be afraid. And today, we get one of the most important figures in the Christmas story front and center. It's not the Magi. It's not the angel who warned them, but Herod. Today, we're going to spend a few minutes with Herod, who had been ruling for about 40 years before our story of Jesus begins. Herod, who eventually kills 3 of his own children out of fear they will take over. Herod, who loved his wife so much that while he was traveling away to visit the capital of Rome, told people if he did not return for some reason, always paranoid, that she should be put to death, because he could not imagine, even in his afterlife, seeing her with another man. He eventually had her killed as well, out of paranoia put into his mind by his sister, that his wife might be turning on him, and he couldn't imagine being angry at her, so he had her killed first. If anyone needed an angel, if anyone ever needed an angel to tell them to stop being afraid, it was Herod. So it begs the question, where is Herod's angel? Herod was called King of the Jews. Ethnically, he was Arabian. He was a practicing Jew, though, partially to fit in with the people that had been appointed to be ruler over. The emperor of Rome had made him king over this territory, and he had expanded it. He had done well with the title he was given, but along the way with success becomes paranoia of losing it. Along with power comes the corruption and the price of privilege, the fear of not having it again. Fear and paranoia, the need to control others, they will lead us to do unspeakable things. Fear and paranoia, the need to control. Now let's be clear. When we read the story today, as we read about the Christmas unfolding in the tragedy side, the children killed as Herod seeks the would-be king, there's really no historical evidence towards it. Matthew's the only mention anywhere. The early Jewish historians don't mention it, but there's a thought that they might not have. In Bethlehem, a city that size, if he killed all the babies born within a certain time period, it would have been 7 to 10 people. Not maybe the massacre we imagine. But that assumes this is a historical event anyway. And rather than get caught up on trivial things like the inerrancy of Scripture, let's get to the truth of the matter, the truth of the story, the heart of it all. The Magi bring gifts to Jesus, representing his kingliness, his position as high priest, and the sacrificial leader he will become. The Magi stand as symbols for the world beyond the Jewish community, the inclusivity of Jesus' message. And it's all foreshadowing, but it often overshadows another story. Everyone else got an angel. Why not Herod? We don't know, but just by asking the question, we're brought deeper into the story. We're invited to delve a little further into the Christmas mystery. Maybe angels were reserved for those people who were doing good. Those working for good. Herod's working for himself. Selfish, no angel. Working for good, you get an angel. It could be that simple. Herod was practicing maybe. Maybe he was just practicing faith, but he wasn't really sincere. Maybe angels are reserved for those that mean it. If you really pray a lot, you get an angel. If not, you're on your own. Maybe, or maybe Herod did get an angel. He just didn't listen. Maybe Herod got an angel, Maybe he heard a message from God, but he was too fearful to respond. Maybe he got the message, but he was too full of self to listen. We just don't know. What we do know is that God doesn't divide good and bad like we do. God doesn't try to separate people out from one another. God's always tried to pull people together. God doesn't give up on people. God doesn't abandon people. So I'm left wondering, what guidance was ignored? What wisdom was dismissed? What hurts were drowning out the voices of angels in Herod's head? In our church, we're fond of saying, God is still speaking. You hear it often from pulpit and in writing. God is still speaking. If that's true, we have to remember that God's voice has never been limited. In Scripture, it came to saints and sinners, young and old, leaders that were expected and outcasts that no one saw coming. God's voice came to everyone. So if God is still speaking, we should all be listening, while also aware that God is speaking to others too. It's not just us. It's not just us who get a voice, who get a guide, who have a mentor, who have God directing their lives. God is speaking to those who will lead us. God is trying to speak to those who will oppose us. God is speaking, but are any of us actually listening? Listening is an active thing, and it's a present thing. Listening requires an assumption that there's more to hear. Listening requires an assumption that there's more to hear. Otherwise, it's called remembering, right? If we're still listening, then there's still something coming, something more to be said. And if we're truly listening, we're never done. We're never done. And maybe that's the gap that we experience in the larger church today. Some are fearful of change, searching for a sameness to cling to. Some are fearful of a new word from the Lord, hearing it as critique rather than new direction. Some are fearful of listening because they may not like the message. It's easier to say, I heard my angel a long time ago, and I'm still following its advice. It's easier to say, my grandparents listened for God, and here's what they told me God said. It's easier to say there is more of grave than gravy to you, Spirit, and follow Scrooge's path of dismissal from an angel or a spirit among us. It's harder to imagine, it's more frightening to imagine God doing a new thing. But isn't that the common thread through all of Scripture? Of course God is doing a new thing. It's a hopeful statement. It's a hopeful statement in a changing world that God could continue to do a new thing in a new time with new challenges in a new place in a new culture. Of course God is still speaking, still sending angels, still whispering in the wind, still inspiring the prophets and the poets, the writers, the musicians, the dreamers. Of course God is still speaking. Are we listening? Or are we tuning out? We heard the angels. They led us to a new world to practice religion freely today. We followed the voice of God. We built a Christian nation from sea to shining sea. We felt the Spirit. It guided us in creating a world power where everybody can earn their keep, pull themselves up by their bootstraps. It's the narrative, right? But I'm guessing those exiled from the early colonies might have felt like the angel's message fell on deaf ears. I'm guessing those forced into labor in our nation's history might feel the voice of God was misunderstood, if not completely ignored. I'm guessing those pushed to the edges of society by bigotry and fear might feel the Spirit's guidance was abandoned long ago. And I'm guessing Herod might have even claimed God put him in power. Why rock the boat? We can see the voice of God and how it has been shouted down through the ages. We can hear our best intentions in a historical narrative, but we can see the results of human fear in the problems handed down. We can hear the hopes of a generation echoed and shared in their voices, but we can also see human frailty in the hurts we are left to mend still today. Listening for the voice of God is a present activity. It is a constant practice, not something that we finished long ago. Like Sunday school, it's not something we graduated from at some point. Like deepening our faith, it's not something we ever get fully complete. God remains bigger than we understand, so the task remains before us. Listening requires us to continue, because there's still more to hear. Listening for the voice of God requires us to set aside our fears. To set aside our fears, remembering that God is also talking to those we're afraid of. God is also talking to those we are afraid of. Listening for the voice of God requires us to set aside our fears, remembering God may have a new message as things change. Listening for the voice of God requires us to set aside our fears, remembering that angels are not reserved for the revered. Angels are not reserved for the revered, but the revered are those who listened and followed. In the face of fear, they listened and they followed. So where are we? Do we have the courage to echo the angel's message in this new year? To tell our friends and our enemies not to be afraid? Do we have the courage to live in our way that gives our friends and our enemies no reason to fear? Do we have the courage to follow the Prince of Peace? Do we have the courage to invite our loved ones and those we fear to listen for God? Do we have the courage to use theological language in our daily life, to seek the voice of angels within strangers, sacred conversation with family members, retelling of family stories, and even watching the news or listening to a song? There is a lot of fear in our world. We constantly act on fear, and the fear often leads us into blame, and it becomes a destructive cycle. But we hear the angel message echoed over and over: be not afraid. If we were no longer afraid, imagine what we might discover. If we made our decisions not out of fear of what could be, but of hope of what will be, if hope were real in the face of fear, what might we discover? That might be our call for the year to come. Telling our friends, those we disagree with, telling our family members, step out of fear and listen for God. Not what God said 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 500 years ago. Not pass down theological rhetoric. Not pass down political jargon from the 90s. But what is God doing right now? And if we were not afraid, what might we hear? Will we have the courage to listen for a new message and a new year? And will we trust that ours is not the only angel on the job? Amen.